talking a little bit about the juvenile justice system and the mental health system, and the history of each of those, and how they are supposed to work together, but more often don't work together in ways that are most helpful. So I'd like you to go back about 110 years to the turn of the previous century. And at that time, kids were up to the age of 7, believe it or not, were incarcerated along with adults. Think about that, incarcerated along with adults. And then somebody had what seems like the obvious idea that now, in retrospect, that kids are very different from adults, and they established the first juvenile court in the country. Anybody know where that was? It was right here in Cook County, our claim to fame, first juvenile court anywhere. And the idea behind that juvenile court was to focus on the rehabilitative needs of youth. Those courts were more informal, and they took on the responsibility of less punishing youth, but more identifying what their rehabilitative needs were and meeting those needs so that they could go on to become productive citizens. So things went along that track for a while until about 1960. And then there was this case of Richard Galt. And let me tell you a little bit about this kid. 15 years old, living in Arizona. He's on probation for a prior offense. He decides to make an obscene phone call. He's arrested. Raise your hand if you think you'd be arrested today for an obscene phone call. Nobody. Okay, so he's arrested. And brought in, charged, tried, and convicted, sentenced to 6 years. 6 years, okay? As a sort of footnote, if he had been an adult at that time, he would have had to pay a $50 fine. But because he was a juvenile, he was under the current practices, he was sentenced to 6 years. That case sort of woke everybody up and said there's something very wrong here. Was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, and is really the seminal case in juvenile justice still, in that it identified that kids in juvenile justice, kids who are arrested, must be afforded the same constitutional protections that adults are. To know what their charges are, their right to an attorney, right to appeal, right to cross-examine witnesses, all of the things that we sort of take for granted that we see sort of in Law and Order and CSI and all this. Kids didn't have those before this case. And so In re Galt, as the case is styled, really established that kids had to have those protections. So even though juvenile court continues to be more informal, it took that case going all the way to the Supreme Court to ensure that kids enjoyed the full constitutional protections that adults did. So move forward a little bit further, and we're now sort of in the mid-70s, early 80s, and there's a spike in juvenile crime. Juvenile crime is going up. And there's some researchers and academics on the East Coast who look at this spike, and they give this interpretation. There's a new breed of teenage super predators. They're out there, they're vicious, they're dangerous, they'll break into your home and all this kind of stuff, and they are immune to rehabilitation. And believe it or not, this super predator idea, won people over. People bought into it, particularly legislators. And so they started making laws in response to this whole super predator idea. The problem was, it was a myth. The spike in crime, so when they were making all these laws, the spike in crime that they were talking about had already started to come down. But even so, they enacted a number of very punitive, harsh sentences for juveniles. And it sort of represents what I think is a continuing swing in the pendulum in juvenile justice between an approach which is more punitive versus that which is more rehabilitative. So they put in, instituted laws like very harsh drug possession laws. They started transferring more juvenile offenders to be tried as adults in adult court. Those sorts of things were in reaction to this sort of super predator myth. So people eventually found out that that wasn't the case, and time goes on, and now it's 2005. And something else sort of monumental in juvenile justice happens. It's a case called Roper v. Simmons. Does anybody know this case? Yes. Roper v. Simmons is a case of a young man, Chris Roper, who, along with he was 17 years old, along with 2 adult accomplices, breaks into a woman's home, just on the other side of St. Louis, breaks into a woman's home to rob her. They end up murdering her. Horrible, heinous crime. Arrested, tried, convicted, sentenced to death. 17 years old. Well, that case also appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, citing a lot of the new evidence and research around brain development around adolescence, what we know about adolescence and sort of judgments and developmental issues that they have, and some of the research that I'm going to talk about in a minute regarding mental illness, the Supreme Court said, can't do it, time out, full stop. Executing people for crimes they committed as juveniles is unconstitutional. You can't do that. And it's kind of interesting to me that that's a 2005 decision for 2 reasons. In my opinion, the 2005 court, remember that's under Bush, right? Very conservative court, right? So it's interesting that that finally came down then. But also, there was a case in 2003, Atkins v. Virginia, where they determined that you cannot execute the mentally retarded. So first it was, think about that, first the Supreme Court said you can't execute people who have cognitive disabilities, and it took them 2 years to get to kids. So it's really interesting, I think, the way things happen legislatively or in the court sometimes. So then that happened. Another huge case in terms of juvenile justice. And then the next case I want to tell you about just happened this year, and it's Graham v. Florida. Anybody know this case? Graham v. Florida. So Graham is a 16-year-old kid born to drug-addicted parents, diagnosed with ADHD, began using substances at the age of 9. He, along with a couple of friends of his decide to break into a store and rob it. And one of his friends works at the store. They get in the store owner is there. And they hit him over the head. He needs stitches. They don't get any money. He's arrested. Charges armed robbery. He's facing 6 years to life without parole. He takes a plea bargain. He's offered a plea bargain. He accepts. He gets 3 years probation. He's out on probation. 6 months later, he's picked up again. The charge now is home invasion. The court said, violated probation, life without parole. He's 16.